Een hele goede morgen allemaal en van harte welkom bij de sessie van vandaag. Het duurde iets langer, want er zat een technisch probleem in het doorklikken naar de juiste sessie. Dus ik hoop in ieder geval dat er nu mensen zijn die hier horen te zijn. En het kan zo zijn dat er later nog meer mensen bij komen. Hebben jullie in ieder geval even lekker de tijd gehad om een kopje koffie te pakken tussen de vorige sessie en nu dan deze door. En dan kunnen we zo lekker gaan starten. Nou, tijdens het EK van deze week worden verschillende online meetings georganiseerd. En de sessie van vandaag van Matthew gaat over welke vormen, omvang en intensiteit je aanbiedt in de verschillende fases van het seizoen vanaf 16 jaar. Ik wil vragen aan Valerie van der Struik om zijn camera uit te doen. In ieder geval iemand die op haar naam zit. Ja, hartstikke bedankt. Nou, zoals ik net aangaf, je ziet hem ook al in beeld, is de spreker van vandaag Matthew Eyles. Matt is kracht- en conditietrainer van het Oranje Dames team en superleuk dat je erbij bent vandaag, Matt. Ik zal zo eerst heel even korte spelregels uitleggen die tijdens deze sessie zullen gelden. En daarna geef ik graag het woord aan Matt en dan gaat hij starten met zijn presentatie. En zijn presentatie zal in het Engels zijn, dus dan weten jullie dat. De spelregels van vandaag. Ik wil jullie allemaal vragen om je camera en je microfoon uit te doen en uit te houden. Tijdens de presentatie kun je vragen stellen via de chat. Als je geen chatfunctie ziet, kun je even klikken op de 3 puntjes en dan staat er helemaal onderaan het gesprek weergeven. Dan kun je de chat wel zien. En als je dan een vraag hebt, zal ik deze tijdens de presentatie aan Matt voor je stellen. En het is ook nog wel leuk om te weten, na afloop van de presentatie hebben jullie de mogelijkheid om zelf de vraag te stellen. Dus als je dat dan wil, dan kun je even je hand opsteken of dat aangeven in de chat. En dan geef ik je de beurt, dan kan je dus je camera en je microfoon aandoen. En dan kun je zelf de vraag stellen. Wat belangrijk daarbij is om te weten, dat de sessie wordt opgenomen en later ook gedeeld wordt en terug te kijken is. Dus als je niet in beeld wil, doe dan niet je camera en je microfoon aan. Dan kan het via de chat. En als je dat wel oké vindt, dan kun je dus de beurt krijgen. Fijn als de chat alleen gebruikt wordt voor inhoudelijke zaken, zodat het een beetje overzichtelijk blijft. En zoals ik net noemde, de sessie wordt opgenomen en wordt ook achteraf weer met jullie gedeeld. Dat waren eigenlijk de spelregels. Matthew zou zo beginnen met zijn presentatie. Dus ik wil jullie eigenlijk heel veel plezier wensen tijdens deze sessie. En ik geef graag het woord aan Matt. Matt, thank you for being here today. Can you introduce yourself for a little bit?
Yeah, sure. Can you hear me? First and
Yes, definitely.
Thanks for the introduction, and thanks for those of you that are here already, and those that might watch it back later. As Sophie said, I'm Matt. I'm the strength and conditioning coach for the Nederlands Elftal Dames. I've been doing that for a little over 4 years now. Since May 2017, after the Rio Olympics, where I went with the Indian men. I worked with a couple of your fellow Dutchmen in India for 3 years, took the boys to the Olympics, and then made my way over to Holland. And prior to that, obviously worked in Sydney, Australia, studied in Sydney, Australia, worked across various sports, a lot of time in rugby league and rugby union. Swimming, surfing, and a variety of other things. So that gets us to now.
Okay, thank you very much. I think you can start with the presentation.
Yeah.
That will be fine. And if there are any questions, please ask them in the chat and I will ask them to Matt for you. Enjoy.
Have a look. This one here. Okay. And everyone can see this screen now, I hope.
Yes.
Okay, great. All right. So what I've been asked to talk about today is Pieken, obviously with a field hockey focus, and I just think it's important to thank the hockey bombs for and a really good chance to sort of get some minds together and hopefully share some knowledge. And also, I hope you all enjoyed the show that the Hockey Dames put on last night. It was a very nice performance onto the semis, so very proud about that one. As Sophie mentioned, we're going to talk. We're going to do the discussion in English, and I hope that nothing gets lost in translation there. As we can see, sometimes things already start to get lost in translation. Pieken als het moet. In Google Translate comes out peaking if you have to, but I'd like to think of it a little bit more as peaking when you have to. Because there is going to be certain moments throughout the season where you do want to peak, you do want to perform at your best, and that's what we're going to talk a little bit about today. I understand that there's different contexts that people are working in. I'm imagining that most of the people here are working throughout a season type situation, so week in, week out games. That's one variation, and then you also obviously have the tournament-based variation, which is a little bit more like, for example, my time in India, where we would have a training camp for 3 to 6 weeks and then travel away on a tour. Little bit different setups in how you would plan your peaking and your tapering and things like that. So if you do have any questions, please feel free to throw them out, and I'll try and stop at a couple of points throughout the presentation so that we can get to those questions if need be. So we're going to talk a little bit about the why, the what, the how, and the when of peaking, and it's a little bit about when can you push a little bit, when can you give your athletes a little bit more, and when should you back off? When do you need to pull back on certain training variables to get the best out of them? So a lot of that is season and competition management, and also a lot of it falls back to basic training principles, okay? Things that we need to remember throughout the year to get the most out of our players, because ultimately everybody wants to sit at the top of the mountain. Everybody would love to be at the top of the beautiful Mount Fuji here, having a look at the nice view down, but not a lot of people are willing to do the groundwork to get there. And as we can see, this is a nice little visual representation. The groundwork is where all the work is done to allow you to peak. So have you prepared adequately? And most of that preparation in a season-based context is going to be done in the pre-season. It is possible to get better throughout the season, but the pre-season is where you're really able to put the foot on the gas and develop those physical qualities. And I've got some nice research later that will show us a little bit about that. But it's really important to remember, and I think if the one thing you can take away from this meeting today, or this presentation, is that your peaking is only as good as your preparation. So it's all well and good to think, okay, we're going to back off now, we're going to taper down, I'm going to get my guys nice and fresh, and we're going to go out and play some really nice hockey or whatever you're playing. If you haven't done the work, if you haven't developed the physical qualities that you want to see in your athletes, then it's not just going to magically appear. So that comes back to some, again, basic training principles, developing the things you want to see in your game. So if you want to play a fast counter-attack game, have you developed speed in the pre-season? Have you got the guys there to be able to do what you want them to do in those more important moments throughout the season? Why would we do it? It's basically to provide the athletes with the chance to perform at their physical best. And again, I'm going to hammer this home throughout the presentation. Their best is going to be determined most likely in the pre-season. So it's really important to remember that. And that's why in the end we might want to build in peaking phases, is to realize all that hard work you've done in your preparation. Ultimately, what it all comes down to, as a lot of team sports do, it's to win. We want to play for those trophies. We want to win the big ones. We have to make sure that our athletes physically, as well as mentally, tactically, technically, are feeling good at the right time. And we'll talk about those things a little bit later as well. If you hear people talk about peaking, some of the things you'll often hear people talk about is tapering. And for me, they're more or less one and the same. You can't really have one without the other. The taper is typically that period of time preceding the peak, so leading up to the peak. Some other terms I've heard around the hockey world is fitness versus freshness. So when are we pushing the fitness, and when do we want our athletes to be fresh? Fitness versus fatigue is something that you'll hear a little bit more in the research. And then what that boils down to is your anabolic versus catabolic. So anabolic being a muscle building, a muscle developing and performance developing phase, and catabolic essentially being a breakdown phase. But it's really important to remember that catabolic is not bad. We need to stimulate those catabolic moments, those catabolic stimulus training to get the anabolic effects, to get the improvements in performance. And ultimately, what we want to see in all that is our guys being at their best. And we might have my first little video isn't working, but that's okay. Shout out to Doc from Back to the Future. So if we go on now a little bit towards the science, most of the science is done in individual sports. That's just a reality. There's very limited research done in team sports, but there's a few good things that we'll have a look at in a minute. But it's also, what can we take from that, the research in the individual sports? How can we take that and apply it to our situation? And when it all boils down to it, most of what you'll read is that the peaking is an incremental reduction in training volume for approximately 7 to 21 days. And that's often in unison with an increase in training intensity or maintaining training intensity. And there is even some research that suggests reducing training intensity. So as always, when you look at research, you have to take it with a grain of salt, because the research world can be quite a bit different to what we have in practice. Similarly to that duration there, 7 to 21 days. 21 days is a long time to taper in a team sport environment. And the reality is you're probably not going to have that amount of time. Time is the biggest enemy when you come to anything with physical qualities in team sports, with the schedules that we put our athletes under and our athletes get put under. But we're looking in team sport probably more that 7 to 10 or max 7 to 14 day taper to allow us to peak. We'll jump into some of the research now. I hope I haven't gone too quickly to start. Are there any questions to this point? I feel like I'm racing through a little bit. If I'm talking too fast, please let Soph know. I can't see the chat now, Soph, and I'll slow down.
Yes, there's nothing yet. If there's something coming in, I will let you know.
Okay, great. We'll work through some of this research. I just want to sort of give you an idea of what the science says, and then again, if there's any questions after we look at a couple of these papers, then I'll stop again and give you guys a chance. Okay, so the first one is I guess looking from the outside, maybe what you'd see as a non-successful scenario. And basically this research just measured a team over a pre-season and then the first period of the season. It's a collegiate soccer team, football team in America. And they basically looked at the training load over a 6 to 8 week period from memory, and what happened with regards to performance, and also some biological markers, some biochemical markers as well. And surprise, surprise, what they found was an inappropriate training, so basically inappropriate training load, and inappropriate recovery leads to a decrease in performance. And I think we all could understand that, but sometimes it is nice to have these things confirmed by the science. And they did see that reduction in strength, power, and endurance, 3 of the biggest qualities we would want to see in a hockey team, or any sort of field sport team for that matter. If we look at some of the graphs that they put forward in their research here, the first one they have is a 20-yard sprint time, okay, so a measure of acceleration. What's interesting in this study is they looked at non-starters and starters. So obviously interchange in football is a little bit different to hockey. So they measured the different results of those non-starters and the people starting. And you can see T1 is the first measuring session of the first week of the competition, okay? And obviously when we're talking about speed, a lower bar is better, okay, because it's a faster time, so it's taking them less time to cover that 20 yards. We can see they start all right, but then they periodically decrease throughout the season. And T6 here, so testing session 6, happened at about 11 weeks into the season. Okay, so from this alone, you can look and say, okay, maybe they carried some fatigue into the competition. That makes sense because what they didn't allow was a taper. So they trained for 6 to 8 weeks, no taper, and then went into T1 here, which is the start of the season. We see a similar result here with vertical jump, so an expression of lower body power. We can see actually here the non-starters are a little bit better. With this graph, we want a higher bar, so that makes a higher jump, and then from that you extrapolate that the athlete is more powerful. And we see really verschillend, to throw a Dutch word at you, results, but definitely no increase in performance. If anything, a slight decrease. And this last graph I found really interesting myself. This one's looking at cortisol concentration within the athletes. So cortisol being a measure of stress, and you have to remember that the body understands stress is stress. Doesn't matter so much if it's physical, emotional, whatever. Stress is stress for the body, and cortisol or increasing cortisol levels will be a result of that. And what's really interesting for this, and it's a little bit off topic to be honest, but if you look at the non-starters here, so these clear graphs, stress is quite a bit higher at the start of the season for them. So you can imagine that they're worried about their position in the team, they're worried about if they're going to get any minutes, and we can see that puts them under quite a larger level of stress. So that's just something to keep in mind in general, I think, for when you're working with your team. So those people that are a little bit less certain about their position in a team, or there's some other form of stress going on in their life, it can be shown in this, and that will, over time, definitely decrease their performance. For the rest, we see it's pretty standard, and then a few weeks into the competition, we definitely get a little bit of a peak in cortisol there. So that could just be, a cumulative thing coming off the preseason with no taper, and no ability to peak. They spike up there in cortisol. And what does this all boil down to? What's the biggest take home from this for me? Is we have to periodize our plans. And we have to plan in advance. We have to allow periods of rest for our athletes, or not so much all rest, definitely, but definitely recovery and periods of decreased training load to allow them to perform at their best. And that brings us forward to the next paper. Paper done by one of my former lecturers down there in Sydney, looking at rugby league. So again, slightly different sport. Unfortunately, with field hockey, we can't be picky and choosy with what research we look at because there's not a whole lot going around in field hockey. But this is a similar setup to the last study. They had a 6-week pre-season preparation, but in this study, they allowed a 7-day taper into the start of the season. Now, this is where we can take away some nice things. Because after the 7-day taper, we saw an increase in strength, power, and endurance. So definitely those qualities we want to see in field sports, such as field hockey. This is a nice little representation of the increase in training load. So they had a fairly linear increase in training load over the 6-week preparation, and then quite a rapid decrease in their training taper. The testing moments were at the beginning of this preparation phase, at the end, and then 7 days after the preparation phase finished at the end of their taper. Now, the other thing, there was most likely in this study also some training done here. This was termed their specific preparation phase. So in this phase would be a lot of the sport, a lot of technical, tactical stuff. In the phase preceding this, there was probably a lot of physical stuff. Now, what I like about this study and what it brings back to field hockey, especially here in the Netherlands, is I'm not sure how many teams, even in the Hoofdklasse, have a full 6-week preparation, maybe 4 to 5 weeks. Hopefully before that, clubs are prescribing some running in this phase over here that we don't see to build some base up. But that 4 or 5 weeks preparation we might see in club field hockey here is somewhat represented here. But that 4 to 5 weeks might not always include a taper in some clubs' cases. So definitely if you're not tapering off towards the end of that, then that's something that you should think about moving forward. If we jump ahead and we look at some of the results, so we see just some really simple measures here. Body mass, judging this body mass, I'm going to say this is a junior rugby league team. It's quite a light rugby league team. Body mass stays more or less the same. So for this sport, that's important. Multi-state MSFT here would be an ISRT, if you're familiar with that, 30-15, basically a maximal aerobic test. And we see pre-training, so at the first start here, 2,200 meters was run. Post-training, after the 6-week preparation, they got worse. But magically or not, after a 7-day taper, they got dramatically better than the post-training and even better than the pre-training. So this is a really important take-home. We see similar things in vertical jump, okay, around 61.7 centimeters vertical jump, which is quite nice. Post 6 weeks, it decreases. And then post the 7-day taper, it increases well past the post-training and even a little bit past the pre-training. Now, you won't see huge changes in vertical jump height in 7 weeks. So it's definitely going in the right direction. They're results that we'd be happy with, especially with the increase in endurance. So one other little reading between the lines thing to take home here is that, say this is your 4 or 5 week club preparation, and you hammer your team, which is great. I love a lot of training load, and you train them really hard for 5 weeks, and then at the end of week 5 is game 1. Maybe your team is not going to perform at their best. Even if you have a short 4-week preparation, you would be better training hard for 3 weeks and then having that. And you can see it's a nice graded decline in training load over that last week. So you can train a bit harder at the beginning of the week and then back off towards the end. Definitely something to think about. And I've been guilty of this in the past myself. Your short preparation. We're going to train really hard for 3 weeks. We're going to test them day 1, and we're going to test them day 21. And your results are the same or maybe a little bit worse. In reality, you've probably made a difference, but you just haven't allowed your athletes time to realise the training that they've done. We've got one more little slide here, and again, we're going a bit biochemical here, with creatine kinase being a marker of sort of muscle breakdown, and we can really see the difference here. So basically, if this number is lower, then we don't have too much muscle breakdown. Post 6 weeks of heavy training, more than double, or almost triple. Triple. The pre-training measure, but after only 7 days, we're almost back to baseline measures. So in 7 days, this team's allowed to recover, and we see body's feeling good, and we're performing better than we have maybe ever before. Okay, we'll keep moving along through. This is the same paper here. And what we have here is basically just a representation of the training load week by week. So just a little bit different version of the graph you saw earlier. And why I wanted to put this one in, because what this training load is a session RPE. So we have a rate of perceived exertion. So how hard was that training session out of 10? Okay, there are various other scales. There's a Borg scale, 6 to 20. Personally, I find that just confuses people. It is used a little bit more in the literature. But a 1 to 10 is simple for everybody, okay? If 10 is the hardest thing you've ever done, okay, maybe the maximal test, okay, and 1 might be a walk recovery session. So you take that rating and then you multiply it by the time of the session, okay? So if it was a really hard but short session, it might be an 8 for your RPE, which the athlete is purely rating by themselves, and then you multiply it by the 30 minutes that the session was. And then you get your time. Then you get your training load, okay? In AU's arbitrary units. This is not meters, seconds, anything like that. It's just more or less a number. So what we can see is that gradual build up throughout the weeks, up to week 6, which is a big week, 3,200 arbitrary units, quite a bit bigger than week 1. And then we have our taper, and our taper is back down again, almost to week 1 training levels. Okay. Now keep in mind that you have developed some fitness over this time. So this number here although it's similar to this number in week 1, is probably a little bit more training, okay? But definitely less than more than half of your training block there, okay? Something that's really useful to use, it's cheap, it doesn't cost a thing. All it costs is a little bit of time. What is really important if you are going to use RPE scales is that you are showing your athletes something like this, and you can go into Google and Google rate of perceived exertion chart, and this will come up. Use it as much as possible, especially early on, so that the athletes become really familiar with, okay, that was really red that session, that was a 9, okay, or oh, that was actually quite nothing, that was quite blue, that was a 2.5 or a 3. Decide early on if you want to use half measures or just use absolute numbers. Probably easier just to use absolute numbers, and use it. You can use it every session, and then it's just a matter of recording that maybe the average for the team is enough, and the time of the session you should know anyway. And then you can do this week by week. Okay, if you've got a bit more time, you might do it per athlete. Okay, make yourself a nice Excel spreadsheet, and then you can judge per athlete how they're perceiving the training is. And this is often very useful for coaches, because quite often coaches and athletes have slightly different ideas about how hard a training is. And what you can also do, and this is taking it a step further, is you can put your session RPE into a acute to chronic workload ratio. So some of you might be familiar with this. Basically, in its simplest form, what it is an average of the last 4 weeks of training divided by the average of the last week, okay? Sorry, other way around. Acute is first and then chronic. So the average of the last week of training divided by the average of the last 4 weeks, okay? Generally what we see then is if you have an AC ratio of 1, then your last week is exactly the same as the average of the last 4 weeks. So you can assume that training is more or less the same. You haven't created too much extra stimulus, so you're not going to have too much extra fatigue, but you also haven't deloaded them in any way. And you can see that here. So if we look at the AC ratios from the session RPEs, by week 6, okay, we're at an AC ratio of 1.2 or 1.23, which for some research is just pushing you into a little warning zone. Okay, generally we like to think of the happy area as between 0.8. If you're below that, you're under training, and 1.2, and if you're above that, you're overtraining. Okay, again, very loose, and you have to work with your own numbers here to find out what's a bit more normal for your group, because I have seen AC ratios of above 2 and everybody's fine. But here we see week 6 is 1.23, and then week 7 is, let's say, 1.6, okay? So quite a lot of difference. Week 7 is a lot different to the average of the last 4 weeks. There we know that they've had some time to recover, some time to replenish, and to freshen up a bit before whatever that event is that you're peaking for, be it the playoffs or the first game of the season, whatever it may be. Okay, keep in mind this research is talking about pre-seasons leading into season, but this might be in the middle of the season, and we'll talk a little bit about when in a minute. Are there any questions about any of that? Because I know we got a little bit sciencey there with AC ratios. I hope I didn't lose anybody. Does anyone have any questions so far about any of that?
We can wait 1 minute for that, Matt. There was nothing in the chat yet, but maybe someone has something. So if you have something, please put it in the chat. We will wait for you.
Yeah, we'll wait a second.
But your story is pretty clear, so I can imagine that no one has any questions.
Okay.
I don't think so, but if something is coming, I will let you know. Yeah,
no problem, no problem. We use AC ratios a lot with Nederlands Elftal, but we use it, I look at it a little bit for session RPE like this. We can also use it, and what it's most commonly used for is distances, so maybe total distance or distance in certain speed zones. So you might look at your AC ratio for what your athletes are covering in meters above 20 kilometers an hour or something like that. For some of you, this is probably nothing new. For some others, maybe it is.